A black woman in a navy coat enters a courthouse with nothing but a folder and quiet purpose. Minutes later, a white deputy slams her to the ground, calling her suspicious. Bloodied and handcuffed, she locks eyes with the bailiff and whispers, "Call the governor." That's when they realize this wasn't just a mistake, it was a trap. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The fog sat low across the courthouse lawn that morning, blurring the hard edges of the stone columns and muffling the noise of the city waking up around it. It was the kind of mist that made everything feel heavier, slower, more uncertain. As the traffic lights blinked red into nowhere, a woman stepped out of a blue sedan and closed the door behind her with a soft click. Her name was Camille Joyner. She didn't look like someone the world needed to fear, or someone trying to cause a scene. She looked like someone who had been walking into institutions like this her whole life, with purpose and alone. She wore a fitted navy coat, buttoned to the top. Her low heels clicked with each step on the concrete, deliberate and calm. Her natural hair was pinned into a soft twist at the crown of her head, dignified and neat. In her right hand, held close to her chest, was a thick manila folder. It was sealed tightly, and across the front, in capital letters, read, "The conference." No one saw it yet. No one knew what it contained, but Camille knew, and that was enough to steady her steps. Unlike the young attorneys who passed through the entrance in loud pairs, flashing badges and talking into phones, Camille entered alone. There was no entourage behind her, no camera crew, no state trooper offering a protective escort. It wasn't out of pride. It was by design. She had insisted on walking in, with no announcement, no special security detail from the state attorney general's office. "I am filing a complaint against this courthouse," she had told her aide the day before. "Then I should walk through its front doors like any other citizen. Let them see how they really treat people." It was early. A chill clung to the air inside the stone building. The marble floors glistened faintly beneath overhead fluorescence. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a metal detector beeped. A fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead. Camille stepped forward into the main lobby, her coat still damp with morning air, and scanned the posted court directory. Most of the officers hadn't opened yet, but she already knew exactly where she was going. Room 214, the Office of Civil Review and Ethics Administration. That's where the documents needed to go. That's where the reckoning would begin. Just before she took her next step, she felt the weight of a gaze. At the corner of the entry station, a tall, white deputy leaned on the security desk, coffee in hand, watching her. He didn't look away. Camille nodded gently in acknowledgement, but his eyes narrowed instead of responding. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but she felt it. That reflexive tension, that practiced suspicion. She turned her eyes forward and kept walking. She approached the check-in counter. A white woman in a courthouse polo sat behind the glass, typing quickly. She barely looked up. "Delivery?" the clerk asked flatly. Camille blinked. "No, I'm here to file a formal review request." Her voice was soft but clear. The clerk looked at the folder, then at Camille's face, then back again. Her expression didn't change. "You need ID," she said, finally. Camille nodded, already reaching into her purse. Camille reached slowly into her handbag, calm and composed, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Her fingers touched the edge of her identification badge. State Ethics Officer of the Attorney General, but before she could pull it out, a voice behind her sliced through the quiet. "Mommy?" The tone was familiar, too familiar. The kind of tone that didn't come from curiosity or courtesy. It came from assumption. Camille turned to face the man who had spoken. It was the same white deputy who had been watching her from the security desk earlier. Mid-40s, tall, chest puffed slightly, like he needed the world to know who was in charge here. His name tag read, D. Camille asked gently. "Oh, can I help you with something?" he said, walking toward her now, each step echoing in the tiled lobby like a warning. "I'm here to submit a formal complaint. I was just presenting my ID." Camille replied, holding her voice steady. She started to extend the badge from her purse. Colburn cut her off. "A complaint, huh?" He gave a dry chuckle, looking her up and down. "That sounds real official." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Camille didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a statement measured, quiet, deliberate. She wasn't rattled, but the energy in the room had changed. The clerk glanced nervously at Colburn, then busied herself with papers that didn't need organizing. Colburn's eyes flicked to the folder. "What's in the envelope?" "The information is protected under state oversight," Camille replied, still calm. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he repeated, as if she hadn't already said she was holding it. Camille nodded once, slow, then said again, "I was just reaching for it when you interrupted me." But Colburn was already waving her off. "Just come with me," he said, motioning for her to follow. "Let's get you sorted out back." Camille frowned slightly. "Deputy, there's no need. I'm here in an official capacity." He raised a hand, palm up. "You're not in trouble, ma'am. We just need to verify some things." His voice had the fake calmness of someone who wanted control, not clarity. He didn't wait for her consent. He turned and started walking. After a moment, Camille followed. Not because she had to, but because she needed to see this through, and because she was documenting every second of it in her mind. As they walked, a janitor mopping the lobby floor paused. He watched the woman with the folder disappear down a side hallway, following a man whose smile was all performance. The janitor blinked once, shook his head gently, and returned to scrubbing the same square of marble floor. He had seen this story before, just not with a folder marked Court Oversight and Ethics Division. The hallway Deputy Colburn led her into wasn't part of the public official corridors. The fluorescent lighting was harsher back here, more sterile. The sound of Camille's heels echoed differently, now sharper, almost confrontational against the linoleum floor. There were no paintings or courthouse plaques on the walls, just cracked beige paint. It felt like she had left the courthouse and entered something more private, more guarded, more dangerous. Camille kept her pace steady. She didn't ask where they were going. She knew if she did, it would only feed into his false authority. Still, her hand gripped the manila folder a little tighter. Behind them, the courthouse lobby continued on in ignorance. Lawyers argued in elevators. Clerks scurried between filing cabinets. No one noticed the absence of one woman. No one heard her name. No one asked. Because people like Camille, black, female, official but unescorted, move through these institutions in silence until something broke. They reached a small, dimly lit office. Colburn opened the door and gestured inside. "Just a moment," he said, motioning with that same fake warmth. Camille stepped inside slowly. There were no windows, just a battered table, 2 chairs, and a mounted camera in the corner with a blinking red light. "I don't believe this is protocol," she said, standing straight, folders still pressed against her chest. "Ma'am," Colburn replied, "I need to verify your identity before you submit anything. You understand?" She met his eyes. "I am an officer of the court. I identified myself twice. You've had no basis to remove me from the public area." He took a step closer. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not going to walk in here flashing folders and talking big. You want to be treated with respect? Act like you earned it." There it was, the crack in the mask. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply placed her badge on the table, slowly, then followed it with the sealed folder. She didn't speak. Her silence was the answer. Colburn didn't even glance at the badge. Instead, he stepped forward and picked up the folder. "Let's just take a look at what's got you in such a hurry today." Camille reached out, her hand firm. "That document is sealed. Touching it without cause is a violation." Colburn laughed. "Lady, you don't get to tell me what the law says. Around here, I enforce it." Then, without warning, he placed the folder back down, but the smile had vanished. His eyes had narrowed, and his voice dropped. "You think walking in here with that little folder and a government ID makes you somebody? You think this place is going to change just because you say so?" Camille didn't answer, not because she didn't have words, but because she had something better: proof. She took a quiet breath. "I came here to give this courthouse a chance to clean itself, but now you've made something else necessary." And as she turned to walk toward the door, he stepped in front of it. "You're not going anywhere just yet," he said flatly. Their eyes locked. The camera in the corner blinked silently. The red light continued its rhythm. Colburn hadn't realized yet that everything he'd done had just been captured, not just by the lens, but by history. That's when Camille said it, not loudly, not with force, but with absolute clarity. "Call the governor." And everything, the silence, the suspicion, the system, shifted. Because now, it wasn't just a folder. It was a fuse. The hallway was narrow, quiet, and too clean, like it had been built to hide things rather than to reveal them. The walls were the same off-white as every forgotten office in America. A cracked sexist sign flickered at the far end. Camille walked behind Deputy Colburn, her breath steady, her hands by her side. The folder was back in her grasp, slightly bent now from the tension earlier, but still sealed. She had not raised her voice, had not made a scene, had not done anything to provoke what was coming next. But in places like this, that didn't matter. Colburn didn't speak as he led her past 2 closed doors and a vacant processing desk. The air back here was colder than the rest of the courthouse, as if the HVAC had been set intentionally lower. Camille glanced briefly up at a nearby ceiling tile. No cameras. That was no accident. She already knew. She asked, her voice even and clear, "Is there a reason we're not in the public administrative wing?" Colburn's answer was sharp. "Secondary screening. You're not on the schedule. You entered with classified documents. I have the right to detain you for clarification." "You do not," she said plainly. "This is not TSA. You have no probable cause. I am a state official." "Exactly," he cut in. "And that's the problem." They stopped near a door labeled Records 3B. It was unmarked otherwise. The kind of room no one paid attention to. Colburn turned to face her fully now, hands on his utility belt, a smirk curling the edge of his mouth. "Let me see the folder," he said, nodding toward her hand. Camille's eyes didn't blink. "You are not authorized." His hand moved without warning. She barely had time to step back before he grabbed her by the upper arm, hard. It wasn't a request, it was control. His fingers dug into the fabric of her coat as he yanked her forward. The folder slipped from her hand and hit the tile floor with a hollow slap. Pages inside shifting but not spilling. "Let go of me," she said sharply, trying to brace herself, but his grip only tightened. And then, it happened. He turned her, spun her like a threat. Her back hit the wall. The pain was immediate, but muted by adrenaline. Her shoulder jerked against the plaster, and her glasses tumbled from her face, landing near the baseboard. Her cheekbones scraped the wall. She gasped, not from fear but from disbelief, a moment of raw, naked shock, not just at the violence, but at the fact that it was happening here, in this building, in this way, to her. Colburn shouted something unintelligible as he forced her toward the floor. She tried to resist, only by voice, never physically. But it didn't matter. He shoved her forward, one knee pressing down on her spine as her chest hit the tile. The folder lay just inches from her hand now, out of reach. The edge of her coat tore, her lips split against the white tile. He yanked her arms back and locked the cuffs hard enough that she winced. But she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply said, "Call the governor." For a second, Deputy Colburn froze, his knee still grinding into Camille's back, but something in her voice pierced through the performance of control. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't defiant. It was calm, like someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly what the consequences of this moment could be. "Call the governor." She repeated it, not louder but clearer. Colburn blinked, his grip tightening as if instinct told him to double down. But doubt had entered the room now. Camille wasn't acting like a protester or someone flailing in fear. She was composed despite the blood at her lip and the cuffs cutting into her wrists. Her voice held authority, purpose. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. A second later, a young bailiff appeared in the doorway, early 20s, fresh hair clip lookered in hand, still learning how to look important. His nameplate read, B. Murray. His eyes widened instantly at the sight in front of him. A black woman, face bloodied, pinned to the floor beneath the full weight of a white deputy. The manila folder on the ground, the red stamped label even from 6 feet away. Office, Division, Office of the Attorney General. "Ah? What is going on?" he stammered, stepping forward in a panic. Colburn turned his head slightly. "Back off." She was acting erratic, tried to force entry without ID. "That's not true," Camille said from the floor, her voice clipped but still calm. "My ID is in my purse. He never let me show it." Bailiff Murray looked between them. His instincts were conflicting. Training told him to defer to senior officers, but something felt off. He could see her badge on the floor now, not far from her glasses. And then her face. Her expression wasn't frightened. It was tired like someone who had warned the storm was coming, and now had to ride it out alone. "I need to call the supervisor," Murray said, stepping back. Colburn snapped, "You do that, you're done here. Understand me?" But Murray didn't move toward the phone. Instead, slowly he walked over and crouched beside the folder. His hand hovered over it like it might burn him. Then, carefully, he picked it up. It felt heavier than it should, because he could already tell it wasn't just paper inside. It was accountability. Delayed, denied. But here, now, undeniable. He flipped open the front cover, just enough to see the heading. Subject, Formal Judicial Misconduct. Complaint, 14th District Court. To State Oversight Director. From Camille Joyner, Ethics Officer, OAG. Murray's breath caught. His eyes rose slowly from the folder to Camille, still on the ground, still bleeding. Her eyes met his. She didn't blink. He said nothing, just stood, folder in hand, and backed away toward the hallway. Colburn yelled after him, "You don't take that out of this room, bailiff. I'm telling you." But his words fell flat. Murray had already turned the corner. Deputy Colburn stood there for a moment, frozen in a posture of dominance that no longer held weight. The door clicked shut behind Bailiff Murray. The echo of his departure lingered in the air like a warning bell. Camille lay still, her cheek pressed to the cold tile. Blood from the cut at her lip had begun to dry, a thin line darkening across her jaw. Her breath came evenly now. She wasn't struggling, she wasn't shouting. Her silence had more power than anything Colburn could muster. And that terrified him. He stood, finally removing his knee from her back, but not before reaching down roughly to pull her to her feet by the cuffs. The sudden motion sent another jolt of pain through her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. Her coat hung torn from one side, the fabric stretched, and frayed where he had gripped her. Her hair was out of place, curls flattened on one side from the floor. Her glasses still lay broken near the wall. Colburn hissed under his breath, as if trying to recalibrate. "You want to play games with state oversight? You think you can walk into my courthouse and throw weight around?" Camille finally turned her head toward him. Her eyes were cold, steady. "This isn't your courthouse. That's what you still don't understand." She didn't yell. She didn't spit back rage. She stood there, cuffed, bruised, bleeding, and made him feel smaller than a child. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. And truth, in that moment, was louder than any siren. Colburn turned away to grab his radio, trying to reassert control, but his fingers trembled. Static crackled as he fumbled for a signal. "Central, this is Colburn. I've got a possible 1096 inch in Records 3. B. Advise on next steps." There was a pause on the line, a beat. Then the dispatcher replied, "Confirm subject identity." Colburn paused, jaw tight. Black female, mid-40s, name Camille Joyner. A second, longer pause. Then, please hold, do not engage further, supervisors en route. Colburn blinked. That wasn't normal. That wasn't procedure, and he knew it. He turned to Camille again, but she had already shifted position. Even cuffed, she carried herself like a woman on the bench, not the floor. The silence pressed in tighter now. Her words earlier, "Call the governor," kept playing in his head like an unwanted loop. That's when the door opened. Not the supervisor yet, not reinforcements, just a janitor. Older black man, gray hair, quiet. He had been polishing a stairwell nearby when he saw the folder hit the floor earlier, saw her being pulled away, saw what most would overlook. He looked at Camille, then at Colburn, then at the folder now missing from the scene. "Everything all right in here?" the janitor asked calmly. Neither answered. But Camille lifted her chin. "Would you do me a favor, sir?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Find Bailiff Murray," she said, "and tell him not to let that folder out of his sight." The janitor gave the slightest smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll see to it myself." And as he left, quietly closing the door behind him, Camille stood a little straighter, even with blood on her face, cuffs on her wrists, and the system still pressing in from every side. Because the reckoning had already begun. The folder moved like a current, silent but undeniable. Bailiff Marcus Murray wasn't usually one to get involved in anything outside the chain of command. He did his job, kept his head down, and made sure the day moved along without too much noise. But when he picked up the manila folder from the floor and saw the bold words printed on its front, his gut clenched. He didn't know who the woman on the floor was, but something in her eyes, something in the deliberate calm with which she'd whispered, "Call the governor," wouldn't leave him, so he did what instinct told him to do. He took the folder upstairs. The administrative wing of the 14th District Courthouse was unusually quiet. Sunlight tried to press through the thick frosted windows, but inside it still felt cold, institutional, and too bright. Marcus didn't stop to chat with reception. He walked straight past them, holding the folder like it was radioactive, and opened the door to Chief Court Administrator Lynn Everhart's office without knocking. She looked up, startled and clearly irritated. "Murray, I'm in the middle of—" "I know," he said quickly, laying the folder down on her desk and flipping the cover open. "Ma'am, I think you need to see this." Everhart's eyes scanned the label first, then the contents inside. Her lips parted slightly, her face draining of color. For several seconds she didn't speak. Then she reached for her landline and dialed an internal extension. "Get me Judge Rainey right now," she said, then hung up. She looked back at Murray and said, "Where's the woman?" "Still in holding," he replied, voice low. "She hasn't said a word. She was assaulted." The deputy— Everhart's face twisted, though whether it was anger or dread, Murray couldn't tell. "Who is she?" she asked finally. He hesitated. "I don't know for sure, but that folder, I think she's someone big." Everhart didn't answer. She flipped deeper into the folder, her eyes now moving rapidly across pages, her brow furrowed. Her hand stopped turning when she reached a page that included a letterhead stamped from the State Attorney General's office, and, at the bottom, a signature, Camille Joyner. It hit her then. The woman downstairs wasn't just someone. She was the chief ethics officer for the state, an investigator who had jurisdiction over the very judges who presides in this courthouse. Her name had come up in briefings once or twice, always in hush-hush tones. No media, no leaks. She moved in silence and landed like thunder. Everhart sat down, the weight of the folder suddenly making her desk feel smaller. The woman Colburn had assaulted, handcuffed, pinned, mocked, wasn't some random protester. She was the woman sent to expose them. And they had just confirmed everything she needed to prove. Back in the lower-level holding room, Camille Joyner sat on a steel bench with her wrists still cuffed, her shoulders relaxed, but her posture steady. The blood had stopped seeping from her lip, drying at the edge of her chin in a thin red line. Her coat was torn at the hem, and her hands, although restrained, remained loose in her lap, as if she were simply waiting for a meeting that had been delayed. Across from her stood another officer, a younger man in a beige uniform with pale skin and visibly shaking hands. Unlike Colburn, this deputy looked unsure of everything: his job, his orders, and especially the woman sitting in front of him, who radiated a calm he didn't understand. He kept glancing at her, and then at the closed door, as if waiting for instructions that never came. Camille said nothing. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand to be released. Her silence was measured, intentional, and disarming. She let them make the next move. Upstairs, chaos was spreading without noise. The presiding judge of the courthouse, Leonard Rainey, had just entered the administrative suite, his black robes tucked neatly over his arm, face drawn with concern. He had barely made it past the threshold before Everhart handed him the open folder. His eyes moved across the top page, his mouth tightening with every second. "This is her?" he asked quietly. Everhart nodded. "We verified it with the AG's office. Her arrival was confidential. She was here to file an internal ethics complaint targeting this courthouse." Rainey let out a sharp exhale, almost a laugh, but bitter. "And we assaulted her before she even made it to the third floor." "She was dragged off before she could identify herself," Everhart added, "by Colburn." Rainey's lips pressed into a line. "Where's the deputy now?" "In Review 3, she said. "Waiting." "Waiting for what?" The boy stepped forward, his head bowed. The judge didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the office, folders still in hand, his face stormy. Meanwhile, in another wing of the building, Deputy Travis Colburn sat in a small, windowless interview room. The smugness he had worn like armor earlier was beginning to fray. He bounced one knee nervously, staring at the scuff marks on the table. He hadn't been formally accused of anything. No one had raised their voice. But something had changed. Something was off. The door opened, and in walked Judge Rainey and Everhart, both stone-faced. Colburn sat straighter. "I don't understand what this is about," he said quickly, voice defensive. The woman didn't identify herself. She looked suspicious. "Stop," Rainey said. Just one word, firm, cold. Everhart placed the folder on the table, opened to Camille's official credentials. Her name, her signature, her photograph. Colburn blinked. "What is this?" Lou Everhart said, "Is the woman you slammed to the ground and handcuffed, in full view of courthouse surveillance. That is the chief ethics officer of the state attorney general's office." His mouth opened, then closed again. "He didn't even say." "You didn't let her," Judge Rainey replied. "The cameras show everything." And for the first time, Colberg's face turned pale. Down in holding, the air felt heavier now. The young officer watching Camille hadn't moved from his post, but his grip on his radio had relaxed. The tension was no longer just about protocol. It had transformed into something deeper, something unspoken. The way she sat, the way she held herself, even bloodied and bruised, made her feel like the only person in the room who was in control. Then the door opened, not with a bang but with a click, soft, mechanical. The same junior bailiff, Marcus Murray, entered, carrying a pair of keys, and wearing an expression that hovered between shame and reverence. He didn't speak as he knelt beside her and unlocked the cuffs. His hands trembled. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly. "They know now. They all know." Camille simply nodded once. No anger, no gloating, just recognition that this moment, humiliating as it had been, had served its purpose. "I'd like my folder back," she said calmly. Murray handed it to her. "They're waiting for you upstairs." Camille rose slowly, one hand briefly brushing over her coat's torn seam, the other gripping the folder that had been nearly lost to brutality. Her glasses were bent slightly at the edge, but she placed them back on her nose as though they were a crown. She took a breath, short but steady, and walked toward the door. The hallway ahead seemed longer now, but it didn't faze her. As she walked, the memory of a meeting from weeks ago surfaced in her mind. She had been in a modest, windowed office at the State Attorney General's headquarters, sitting across from two of her closest advisors. One of them, an older woman named Nia, had leaned forward and warned her directly. "You go into that courthouse alone, Camille. They won't see your title. They won't see your rank. They'll see what they want to see. A black woman with a folder they don't recognize." Camille had replied without hesitation, "That's exactly why I'm going." Her other advisor, a younger attorney named Julian, had looked uneasy. "Why not alert them ahead of time? Bring a press liaison, send someone from your team." "Because I need the truth," Camille had answered. "And truth doesn't show itself when people are on their best behavior. I need to see who they are when no one's watching." She had gone in knowing the risk. She had walked into that courthouse unannounced, on purpose, trusting that the system she dedicated her life to could still be held accountable. And now the system was facing her, wounded, exposed, and watching. As Camille approached the elevator that would take her to the judge's chambers, courthouse staff members moved aside wordlessly. Some recognized her now, others had only just found out who she was, but all of them felt the gravity of what had happened. She stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and for the first time since entering that building, she allowed herself one deep exhale. Not out of exhaustion, out of certainty. The reckoning had begun, not just for Colburn, but for every institution that had taught men like him that their bias was a shield. And Camille Joyner had come to take that shield away. Camille Joyner didn't burst out of holding. She walked, slowly, without apology, without help, without fanfare. The silence surrounding her exit fell heavier than any shouts. Not a single word of regret passed from the mouths of those who had cuffed her, restrained her, or ignored her name. The deputies didn't even meet her eyes. The bruises at her wrists, barely visible under her coat sleeves, throbbed with a dull ache. But she gave no sign of weakness. She had survived something brutal, and now she was stepping into something even more dangerous, the spotlight. The lieutenant from the governor's protective detail escorted her, but a few paces behind her, not ahead, not beside. It was as if even he understood this walk had to belong to her alone. She clutched the manila folder against her side like armor. It was slightly bent now, with its corners frayed from being stomped in the scuffle, but she carried it with pride. It held more than paper. It held names, patterns, evidence, and power. A staffer rushed up to her just before she exited the building, offering a bottle of water and a chair. "Ma'am, you should rest," he said gently. Camille glanced at him once grateful, but unmoved. "I've waited long enough," she replied. As she stepped back into the courthouse lobby, the hush that fell over the clerks and staff was almost reverent. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her silence made every onlooker squirm more than shouting ever could. She walked past the same front desk clerk, the white woman who had cut her off earlier, who had refused to listen, who assumed the well-dressed black woman before her had come to deliver someone else's message. Camille paused briefly in front of her. She didn't speak, just looked at her. That single glance was sharper than any rebuke. The clerk dropped her eyes to the desk, unable to meet the weight of Camille's gaze. Then Camille turned and kept walking. Outside, the fog had lifted, replaced by harsh daylight and a sea of reporters. Word had spread. Someone inside had leaked enough of the incident to draw every major outlet to the courthouse steps. Flashbulbs sparked. Questions through the air like birds startled from a tree. But the crowd hushed the moment Camille emerged. Standing at the top of the steps were Governor Alicia Barnes and Attorney General Miles Beckett. Governor Barnes, tall and dignified in a navy suit, looked like thunder wrapped in silk. Her expression betrayed the outrage of someone who had fought too long and too hard to see this happen to one of her own. Attorney General Beckett's hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw working as he scanned the crowd. When he spotted Camille, his eyes softened, but he did not move forward. This was her stage. The governor took the mic first. An ethics officer from my administration, she said clearly, was unlawfully detained and assaulted while attempting to file a report on systemic misconduct. She came with truth. She was met with violence. Gasps echoed. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras rolled. Then the governor stepped aside and nodded once. 7, she said. You'll hear from her directly. Camille Joyner stepped to the podium, folder in hand. But Camille Joyner adjusted the microphone, placed her folder on the podium, and opened it with calm deliberation. The creased edges whispered of everything that had happened, how this folder had been slammed to the ground, how its contents had been dismissed before they were ever read, how its presence alone had triggered a violent reaction. Now, the very thing they tried to silence was about to speak louder than any of them could have imagined. She began without preamble. My name is Camille Joyner. I serve as Chief Ethics Officer for the Office of the Attorney General. I arrived at this courthouse this morning to submit a confidential oversight complaint regarding this facility, its personnel, and its long-standing pattern of abuse against civilians. She glanced up briefly, letting her words settle into the bones of every listener. What I encountered instead, she continued, was precisely the misconduct I came here to address. But let me be clear, I'm not here for my own sake. I'm here for the people whose voices were buried long before mine. She pulled out a stack of documents, held together by a paperclip. Need are 9 formal complaints filed between 2016 and 2024, each submitted by a civilian against deputies operating inside this courthouse. Each one of them dismissed, not investigated, not acknowledged, buried. She looked directly into the cameras now, her voice measured, her tone steady. Every complainant was a woman of color, Black, Latina, Southeast Asian. Each of them described similar treatment, being labeled aggressive, emotional, combative, not for actions, but for questioning authority, for standing too tall, for speaking too clearly. She let those words hang in the air. Then she did something no one expected. She read their names. Marina Diaz, harassed in the lobby after asking for her translator, case closed due to insufficient evidence. Mrs. Keisha Langston, pushed down a stairwell by a deputy after requesting to see her detained son. Case closed. No video footage available. Miss Aisha Graham, detained for refusing to surrender her phone during jury duty check-in. Case dismissed. Deputy acted within protocol. With each name, her voice never cracked, but the crowd grew visibly unsettled. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared, unable to look away. The women came forward. They followed procedure. They trusted this system, and they were silenced, not just by the deputies who harmed them, but by the internal processes that allowed those deputies to remain in uniform. She set the stack of complaints aside and reached for a final document. This morning, Camille said, her voice tightening just slightly, I was accused of being erratic, combative, threatening, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resist. I didn't even finish introducing myself before I was slammed into a wall. A collective hush swept across the plaza. Reporters were frozen. Microphones caught the sound of her breath, quiet but firm. She closed the folder. The only thing erratic here was the silence. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with something deeper. Gasps, whispers, realization. It wasn't just about Camille. It never was. She had done what the system never expected. She walked in, unarmed but prepared. She had let them expose themselves. And now, the whole country was watching. The moment Camille stepped away from the podium, there was no applause, no flash, not even whispers, just silence. dense, staggering silence, as if the entire crowd, officials, reporters, staffers, and spectator, had forgotten how to breathe. And then, like pressure escaping from a sealed valve, everything erupted. Cameras surged forward. Journalists began shouting questions over one another, each more desperate than the last. "Ms. Joyner, were you targeted? Is the governor calling for immediate investigation? Will Deputy Coburn be arrested? Why weren't these complaints made public before now?" Camille didn't flinch. She nodded politely at the press and stepped back, allowing Governor Barnes to take her place again. The governor's face was thunderous. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "We are launching a full and independent inquiry," she said, her words like courtroom verdicts. "Effective immediately, the deputy involved, Travis Coburn, is suspended without pay pending criminal investigation. The courthouse's Internal Affairs Division will be turned over to the State Inspector General's office." The Attorney General stepped forward. "All previous complaints that were closed without external review will be reopened," he added. "We will also be investigating whether court officers or administrators suppressed these reports to protect personnel. There will be consequences." But it wasn't just about policies now. Something else had shifted, something deeper. Across the country, news outlets were already rolling the footage. Camille's calm presence, her cutting line, "The only thing erratic here was the silence," became an instant headline. It lit up every major platform within hours. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, all pulsing with the same moment. Clips of her speech flooded timelines. Activists began resharing past cases. Hashtags exploded. Voices gained in compelling tone. Black-white matter. Ethics matter. And one more. The silence ends. At home, in living rooms and dorm rooms and break rooms, women watched that footage and saw themselves. Not in the violence, but in the quiet indignity. The refusal to be seen. The condescension. The disregard. And then, in Camille's steadiness, they saw something else. Power reclaimed. Back inside the courthouse, everything felt different. The air had shifted. Staff walked a little straighter, or a little more carefully. Some whispered. Some looked ashamed. The front desk clerk who had dismissed Camille earlier was being quietly pulled into an internal interview. The AR director was already on a call with legal. And Camille? She was in a conference room with the governor and her legal team, drafting a formal referral to the U.S. Department of Justice. "This isn't just about one deputy," she said firmly. "This is a culture, an ecosystem, and it's time we cut it out by the roots." The governor nodded. "And we will. You've set the tone. Now we follow through." Across town, protest signs were already being painted. Outside the courthouse gates, the crowd had begun to gather. Not in outrage alone, but in solidarity. Teachers, nurses, veterans, ministers, students, all there for one reason. They saw what happened, and they weren't going to look away. A little girl stood on the sidewalk, watching through the fence. Her mother leaned over and whispered, "That's the woman who stood up." The girl nodded, holding her mother's hand tighter. Inside, Camille sat down for a press debrief, her coat still slightly torn at the shoulder. "I didn't want to be the story," she said. "I came to report one." She looked into the camera, her voice again calm. "Not by silence, not now, not ever again." And the world listened. The next morning, the courthouse was no longer just a place of law. It had become a hive of investigation. Unmarked sedans parked in a tight row near the loading bay. Plainclothes internal affairs officers moved with purpose through the lobby. Their eyes scanned everything. Their folders were stamped with state authority, and their questions came with subpoena power. The tension was unmistakable. Gone was the casual murmur of staff making small talk, or judges striding in with clerks at their side. Now, every footstep weighted too sharply. Every glance carried weight. The courthouse wasn't just under review, It was under siege from within. The HR office, once a quiet corner with locked cabinets and routine memos, had become a war room. Personnel files were being pulled from archives, boxes with tabs dated back 10 years. Red flags began to emerge almost immediately. Identical complaint, language recycled dismissals, signatures that all matched the same name. The chief administrative officer looked pale as she reviewed one stack. "How did we miss this?" She asked no one in particular. But the truth was, they hadn't missed it. They'd filed it, buried it, and moved on. Meanwhile, Camille Joyner arrived through the front entrance, not escorted, not hidden. She wore a dark gray blazer, crisp white blouse, and a state badge that gave her full access to everything. And everyone. She walked past the same security checkpoint where she'd been profiled just days before. The deputy on duty stiffened. She didn't speak to him. She didn't have to. Inside, the atmosphere changed with her presence. She no longer moved alone, no longer questioned. A pair of state aides walked behind her, one carrying a portable scanner, the other a digital recorder. They passed a group of clerks, who quickly fell silent. One leaned toward another and whispered, "She's the one, the woman from the video." The other nodded. "I heard she's not just reviewing Colburn, she's reviewing everybody." And she was. Camille's authority had expanded rapidly. The governor had signed an executive order placing her at the helm of a special review task force. State Directive 84B. It gave her direct access to every complaint, every personnel file, every grievance ever filed in that courthouse. Her first stop was the second-floor administrative wing. She requested a list of prior harassment claims, sealed and unsealed. It was handed to her in silence. Inside one of the interview rooms, she sat across from a young black woman, barely in her 20s, who had interned at the courthouse the previous summer. The woman's voice trembled. "He used to wait for me in the garage after I finished filing," she said. Said it was coincidence. But it happened 3 times in 2 weeks. One time he blocked my car with his, said I looked stressed, offered to give me a shoulder massage. Camille's face didn't change. She simply nodded and asked, "Did you report it?" "I tried," the young woman said. "They said I was reading too much into it." Camille wrote something on her notepad. "Thank you, we're not reading over it now." Down the hallway, Camille entered another interview room where a Latina clerk, mid-30s, sat quietly, with her hands folded in her lap. She looked both prepared and weary, like someone who had waited a long time to be asked a real question. Camille sat across from her and offered a glass of water. The clerk took it, but didn't drink. She simply looked up and said, "I didn't think anyone would ever care." Camille replied softly, "Tell me anyway." The woman began slowly. "When I first started here, I was excited. I believed in justice, in courts. But within a few months, I noticed how they treated women like me, like accessories. Deputies would make comments about my hair, my voice, my clothes. One of them used to whisper, 'You'd look better if you smiled more.' Another told me I had an exotic attitude. I didn't even know what that meant." Camille nodded gently. "Did you ever file a complaint?" "I did, twice," she said. "Both were marked resolve internally. I never even got a follow-up." "Do you remember who signed off on the resolution?" The clerk looked down, then reached into her folder. "I kept a copy," she said. She slid a page across the table. Camille read the signature at the bottom. Her face tightened. Chief Judge Alan Meyerson. That name had come up before, multiple times. In the review Camille's team was building, it was his signature that had appeared over and over on closed files involving harassment, profiling, even use of force complaints, most of which had been quietly dropped without public record. Outside the interview room, Camille's aide approached with a new update. "We've just found a batch of old complaint forms in the IT storage archive. They were digitally deleted from the public system, but still existed in the recovery logs." "La many?" Camille asked. 32, the aide answered. At least 18 directly involved courthouse law enforcement. 11 of those mentioned Deputy Colburn. Camille felt the weight of the information settle on her shoulders. But she didn't break posture. She only said, "Get me copies of everything, and flag anything with Meyerson's name." As she walked back into the hallway, a few deputies glanced up from their desks. One of them, a black deputy named Tyrone, met her eyes and nodded faintly. Camille returned the gesture. He approached quietly. "I've been here 15 years, he said. "I've seen how things work, how complaints disappear, how voices get quiet." She studied him. "You ever file something?" "Once," he said, "back when I was new." Another deputy shoved a Latina clerk during a search. "I reported it to HR. Next week, my shifts changed. My overtime disappeared. I got written up for a uniform violation. I learned quick. Would you be willing to give a statement now?" He nodded. "I would, but I want it on record. No more closed doors." Camille extended her hand. "Then let's open them." They shook hands under the humming fluorescent lights. Around them, the courthouse no longer felt like a temple of justice. It felt like a dam about to burst. Camille returned to the governor's office later that evening, escorted by state investigators and accompanied by her legal team. The energy in the room had shifted. There was no longer hesitation, only resolve. Governor Layton sat at the head of the conference table, eyes sharp, voice steady. "We've reviewed the summary from your preliminary audit," he said, flipping through the compiled documentation. 32 deleted complaints, a pattern of suppression, connections to sitting judges. This is no longer an internal matter. Camille nodded. "It hasn't been for a long time." The Attorney General, seated beside the governor, leaned forward. "You're requesting full investigatory powers, correct?" "Yes," Camille said clearly. "I want authorization to lead a joint task force, independent investigators, subpoena, power, and the ability to issue protective measures for staff and interns who come forward. Without that, the wall stays up." There was a long pause. Then, the governor slid a folder across the table. "Done. You'll have full authority. Effective immediately." Camille opened the folder and saw the state seal at the top of the letter, her name printed beneath it. She took a breath. By sunrise the next morning, courthouse personnel received formal subpoenas. Some were delivered in person. Some were slipped under office doors before the staff even arrived. Others were posted on locked drawers of forgotten hush monies. Inside the courthouse, it was no longer a question of whether there had been misconduct, but how deep the rot went. Chief Judge Meyerson didn't speak to reporters. He issued a brief statement through a spokesman. All prior matters were handled in accordance with internal guidelines at the time. But within the building, his office door remained closed all day. Meanwhile, Camille walked the same hallway where she had once been dragged and cuffed. But now she was flanked by 2 investigators and a digital recorder in hand. She entered one office after another, asking direct questions, recording answers, observing body language. Some employees cried, others lied, but more than a few, especially women of color, breathed easier once she entered the room. In one of the final interviews that day, a veteran court secretary, black, in her 60s, wearing a pinched expression of guarded relief, spoke clearly. "They treated us like furniture, useful, silent, replaceable. But you, Miss Joyner, they can't ignore you anymore, because now the eyes are watching." Camille felt the truth of that settle into her skin, not pride, just purpose. Outside, protest signs had begun appearing across the courthouse lawn. They weren't loud yet, but they were firm. Justice can't be internalized. Power without oversight is violence. Camille Joyner saw it all. The movement was building, but Camille didn't smile. She knew how these things went. Public attention flared like lightning, but change took the weight of storms. That night, as she returned home, she placed the original manila folder, the one that had sparked all of this, into a fireproof lockbox. not to hide it, to preserve it. Because this wasn't the end. It was the middle of something bigger. And Camille Joyner wasn't done yet. It started with a phone line, quiet, discreet, no press release. Just a line for those who had been silenced, erased, or humiliated behind courthouse walls. Camille Joyner insisted on it. She knew that real stories didn't come through press conferences. They came in trembling voices, through tears, behind closed doors. So the number was activated with no fanfare, just a message: you are not alone. You will be heard. Within an hour, it began. The first call came from a woman who didn't say her name. Her voice was low, her words paced carefully. "I work nights," she said. "Cleaning crew, 3rd floor. I was cornered once in the stairwell, told if I wanted to keep my job, I should stop making eye contact." Then another, a legal clerk. "He called me girl every day. I had 2 degrees, but I was always girl. I filed a complaint. HR said it was a misunderstanding. I left 3 months later." Then another. "I used to intern in courtroom 6. I was told not to wear pantsuits. Too aggressive. I watched white interns joke with deputies. They called me cold, distant. I stopped laughing just to feel safe." Camille's team began cataloging every call, every story, every shared wound. Names blurred, details overlapped, but the patterns were unmistakable. The stories were almost identical in tone. Black women, Latina women, indigenous women, recounting the same kind of diminishment, the same kind of dehumanization. They spoke of being told to smile, of being touched without consent, of being called angry when they asserted themselves, and always, they said the same thing: "I didn't think anyone would believe me." By the second day, the calls numbered in the dozens. Camille sat in on several of them herself, headset pressed gently against her ear, listening with a stillness that held every word. At one point her hand trembled, not from shock, but from recognition. One of the callers described Deputy Colburn's laugh. "He laughed when I cried," the voice said. "He said I was making a scene, like I was a show." Camille closed her eyes. She remembered that laugh, cold, detached, the kind that carried no remorse, just control. The team converted the testimonies into anonymized transcripts. They highlighted key words, tracked repeat names, mapped incidents to specific offices and floors. The courthouse, it turned out, had a language of fear, and every woman who spoke added a piece to its translation. Camille didn't just read the transcripts, she studied them. Late into the night, she sat in her apartment, yellow legal pad on her lap, red pen in hand, drawing lines between complaints, matching times, mapping who covered what. Each connection led to another. Each silence traced back to power. It wasn't just Colburn, he was the spark, but the fire had long since spread. And Camille was ready to follow the smoke. She entered quietly. No announcement, no escort. Just the soft shuffle of low heels on courthouse tile and the faint rustle of a cotton church dress. The woman looked to be in her late 60s, her silver curls tucked beneath a modest hat, her purse clutched to her side. Camille noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she tried so hard not to. One of Camille's assistants approached her gently, offering a chair and a cup of water. She declined both. "I didn't come to sit," the woman said. "I came to speak." Camille nodded and motioned for her to follow. Inside the quiet room, the woman didn't even ask for privacy. She simply began. "It was Colburn," she said. 15 years ago, I came here to serve jury duty. I had trouble walking, so I asked where the elevator was. He told me to use the stairs or go home. I said that was rude, and I tried to walk away. That's when he grabbed me, pushed me back against a file cabinet so hard I dropped my bag." Camille leaned forward, listening, her face composed but her hands folded tight. "He looked me right in the eye and said, 'You think you get to talk to me like that?' Then he told me if I opened my mouth, my son could lose his job." Her voice cracked on that last line. Camille blinked slowly. My son was a new bailiff at the time, just past training. He was so proud to wear that badge, I never filed a report. I didn't want to make it harder for him. Camille stood up slowly, then sat beside her. She didn't say anything right away. She just reached for the woman's hand, held it gently. You're not invisible anymore, Camille said. Not today, not ever again. The woman didn't cry. She simply exhaled, a breath she'd been holding for 15 years. Outside that small room, the story had already begun spreading. One of Camille's team members posted a carefully worded message to social media. If you've experienced misconduct inside the courthouse, there is now a place to report it. You will be heard. You will be protected. Within hours, the post had over 10,000 shares. Local activists reposted it. Journalists began asking questions. And survivors began arriving, not just on the hotline, but in person. A court reporter, a retired interpreter, even a former assistant district attorney. Each woman carried something different: shade, rage, sorrow. But all of them carried the same wound. They'd been silenced by proximity to power. Camille met each one with grace. She didn't promise quick fixes. She promised light. I will not allow your pain to be archived and forgotten, she said at the end of one long day. We are documenting the silence, and we are turning it into sound. In those moments, Camille wasn't just an ethics officer. She was a witness, a conduit. And slowly, one story at a time, she was building a record that no one would be able to ignore. The stories didn't stop. They multiplied. Within 48 hours, Camille's temporary review team had logged over 100 calls. Some were short, recorded in whispers between work breaks. Others came with detail, dates, names. Most were anonymous, but every single one was destined. One woman described how she was called "girl" so many times by courthouse deputies that she stopped correcting them. Another recounted how, during a late-night case review, she was locked inside an office and made to listen as a white officer described what he'd do to her if they weren't on county property. A court janitor recalled how she'd found the same deputy's gloves left behind in women's restrooms. Always on Tuesdays. Always after hours. Camille's analysts highlighted them predators operating behind the thin shield of routine. The same names. The same excuses. Repetition disguised as coincidence. It wasn't just one man, it was a network of silence. And yet, amid the horror, something else stirred: courage. A young clerk wrote, I never thought someone like me could say something, but I saw Camille's press conference, and I realize, maybe now I can. Protests began gathering outside the courthouse. First dozens, then hundreds. Signs read, Your silence is violent. Protect black women. Justice can't breathe behind those walls. Camille didn't attend the protests. She didn't need to. She was already inside, doing the work they marched for. But she did accept one invitation. A national news program requested a live interview. It was scheduled for Friday evening, and when the moment arrived, Camille didn't hesitate. Seated across from the anchor, under the unforgiving glare of network lights, Camille wore the same navy coat from the day of the assault. Her lip, still faintly scarred, was a quiet reminder of what silence costs. The anchor began, Mr. Joyner, you were attacked by a courthouse deputy while attempting to file an ethics complaint. That video has now been viewed over 20 million times. Why haven't you stepped away? Camille didn't blink, because stepping away is how this started. For too long, people like me have been told to endure, to document, to stay calm and hope someone else cares. But silence was never protection. Silence was the weapon. The anchor leaned forward. Some have called you a symbol, a movement. Camille's voice didn't rise. It deepened. Being moved, I'm not the movement. I'm the receipt. Every woman who was told she was overreacting, every black staffer who changed how she walked or spoke just to feel safe at work, I am the consequence of a system that thought it could hide behind badges and marble walls. A pause. Then she added, "This is not just about me. This is about every voice that was buried under silence and called justice." When the broadcast ended, viewers across the country sat in stunned silence. Then came the response. Calls to action, editorials, city council resolutions, demands for policy change. Camille didn't watch the segment again. She didn't need to. She had already heard the echo from inside the courthouse walls. And this time, it didn't sound like whispers. It sounded like change. The courthouse was quieter than usual, but tension hung thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. Inside the dimly lit chambers, a torrent of leaked emails flickered across glowing screens in homes and newsrooms alike. The correspondence was damning. The chief judge had personally intervened to block disciplinary actions against Deputy Travis Colburn and 2 other deputies. His fingerprints were everywhere. Handwritten notes, forwarded memos, and backdoor messages ordering while urging silence. For weeks, Camille's team had been digging through records, gathering every piece of evidence they could find. But the email leaks sent shockwaves far beyond their office. Social media exploded, with hashtags demanding justice. The public's patience snapped. Across the city, reporters raced to the courthouse steps, cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Journalists shouted questions about the chief judge's integrity and whether his influence had allowed corruption to flourish unchecked. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on the courthouse like a physical force. Under mounting pressure, the chief judge was forced to hold a press conference. Standing at the podium, his face pale and drawn, he denied the allegations with practiced calm. "I have always upheld the law with fairness and integrity," he insisted. "These accusations are baseless and politically motivated." But his carefully rehearsed statements crumbled beneath the tide of evidence. Screams behind him displayed emails directly contradicting his claims. The crowd's murmurs swelled into a chorus of disbelief and outrage. Meanwhile, Camille prepared for a critical meeting with the newly formed Courthouse Oversight Board. The gravity of the situation was clear. The very institution meant to safeguard justice had been complicit in its erosion. At the table sat community leaders, retired judges, civil rights advocates, and government officials. Camille laid out her recommendation: an immediate temporary suspension of the entire courthouse security team, pending a full, independent review. There was silence, then nods of agreement. The moment was unprecedented. No longer would the courthouse's hidden machinery operate without accountability. The fallout came swiftly. Deputy Travis Colburn was formally charged with assault, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors presented evidence amassed over months, painting a portrait of a man who had abused his authority with reckless abandon. The charges were the first in what promised to be a series of legal actions against those implicated in the courthouse scandal. But Colburn was not alone in his fall. One by one, other deputies quietly resigned, their departures barely noticed outside the courthouse walls. Inside, however, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The once tight-knit security team was fracturing under the weight of revelations and fear. Whistleblowers stepped forward, breaking the silence with damning evidence. Text messages showing crude jokes about courthouse victims, photos capturing deputies violating protocols, and recordings of conversations revealing plans to intimidate witnesses and obstruct investigations. The tide had turned. The system built on silence and fear was collapsing from within. Amid the turmoil, Camille found herself offered an escort into the courthouse for her safety. The suggestion was made cautiously, aware of the threats she faced from those desperate to maintain the status quo. But she refused. She wanted to walk in alone. The same way she had that foggy morning when no one had seen her for who she truly was. As Camille approached the courthouse steps, her footsteps echoed purposefully. The janitor from weeks ago, the same man who had paused to watch her walk away in silence, now stood by the door. This time, when their eyes met, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the change that was coming. Camille returned the nod, steady and unflinching. Inside, the courthouse was a different place. The cracks in its foundation were visible. The walls no longer seemed to shield injustice, but exposed it to light. The fall of the house was underway. News outlets covered every development with relentless intensity. Editorials called for sweeping reforms. Community meetings were packed, citizens demanding transparency and justice. For many, the courthouse had symbolized authority and security. Now it symbolized something else: the courage to confront corruption head-on. Camille led a series of public forums, listening carefully to those who had been silenced for decades. She spoke about accountability, fairness, and the urgent need to rebuild trust. Her calm voice carried the weight of truth and resilience. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly to compile their findings. Reports detailed not only Colborne's misconduct, but systemic failures across multiple levels of courthouse operations. Recommendations included mandatory training on racial bias, creation of an independent civilian review board, and strict new protocols for handling complaints against courthouse personnel. The chief judge's fate hung in the balance. His credibility shattered. He faced calls to resign from elected officials and community leaders. The scrutiny forced him into seclusion, his once imposing presence reduced to whispered conversations behind closed doors. But Camille's mission was bigger than one man. It was about transforming an institution that had allowed injustice to flourish for far too long. At the end of a long day, standing alone in her office, Camille reflected on how far she had come, from that quiet woman clutching a manila folder to the catalyst for change in a broken system. Outside her window, the courthouse stood tall, no longer an unassailable fortress, but a symbol of accountability in motion. The fall of the house had cleared the way for something new, a house built not on silence or fear, but on justice, transparency, and hope. And Camille Joyner was ready to help build it. The morning light filtered through the tall courthouse windows in pale, cold streams, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Reporters from local and national outlets jostled for position. Family members, activists, and ordinary citizens packed every seat and spilled into the aisles. The atmosphere was electric, tense with anticipation, but heavy with the gravity of what was about to unfold. Camille Joyner sat near the front of the courtroom, her hands folded calmly on her lap. The years of preparation, of silent observation, and painful personal ordeal all culminated here. The quiet dignity she carried was a testament to a resilience forged in battles far beyond this courthouse. Around her, familiar faces from the community nodded support, but none more determined than Camille herself. Deputy Travis Colborne, once so commanding and unshakable, looked diminished. His shoulders, usually squared with authority, were now hunched with uncertainty. He sat beside his attorney, Alan Hurst, who whispered last-minute strategies that sounded hollow even to his own ears. The confident sneer that had once masked Colborne's arrogance were replaced with tight lips and wary eyes scanning the room. The judge's gavel hit the wooden block with a sharp crack. Court is now in session. The judge's voice rang clear and authoritative, immediately silencing the murmurs. We are here to hear the case of the state versus Deputy Travis Colborne concerning allegations of assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. The prosecutor, Dana Price, rose with measured confidence. The opening remarks were firm and resolute. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, today you will hear testimony and see evidence that exposes not just the actions of one man, but a pattern of abuse that has haunted this courthouse for years. Deputy Colborne crossed the line, and this trial seeks to hold him accountable. Then Camille was called to the stand. She rose slowly, the courtroom eyes fixed on her every movement. Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she began to recount that harrowing day when power turned violent in the most personal way. She described Colborne's aggressive approach, the sudden shove, the cold, hard impact against the wall. She spoke without anger or hesitation, every word a careful truth. Behind her, the video played on a large screen, every frame dissected. The grainy footage showed Colborne's hand gripping Camille's arm tightly, the shove sending her stumbling and falling. Her glasses clattered to the floor. The blood staining her lip was vivid and raw. a stark symbol of unchecked authority. The courtroom was silent, except for the hum of the video. Even Colburn's defense team could not argue against the undeniable evidence. Camille's calm testimony was a striking contrast to the brutality captured on film. She did not flinch when asked if she was frightened or intimidated. Her reply was simple: "I was not afraid to speak the truth." One by one, the women who had suffered in silence came forward. Their testimonies formed a powerful chorus, their stories weaving a tapestry of systemic abuse that had long been hidden behind courthouse doors. A young black court reporter described how she was followed on multiple occasions by deputies when leaving work late, feeling eyes watching her every step. The harassment had escalated to whispered threats in stairwells. Her voice cracked only once, as she admitted the toll it had taken on her peace of mind. A Latina clerk recounted being repeatedly told to smile more by supervisors, thinly veiled threats of termination hanging in the air. Her words painted a picture of a workplace where fear was a tool wielded against those who dared to be themselves. Another woman, older and dressed simply, described an encounter where Colburn had cornered her against a filing cabinet and threatened harm to her son if she ever spoke out. The courtroom gasped at the rawness of her story. She looked directly at Colburn, her eyes hard with the strength of years spent in quiet endurance. Each account added weight to the mounting evidence. The abuse wasn't isolated, it was institutional. The defense attempted to dismiss the testimonies as anecdotal or exaggerated, but the sheer volume and consistency made denial impossible. The prosecutor's closing argument was both a lament and a call to arms. "This is not about one isolated incident," she declared. "It is about a culture that allowed power to go unchecked." Deputy Colburn and those who protected him believed their badges made them untouchable. They used that power not to serve justice, but to silence those who threatened their control. Her words reverberated through the courtroom. Camille listened quietly, the weight of years of injustice balanced on the precipice of change. The moment the verdict was announced, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Guilty on all counts. 14 years in prison, with no parole for 8. Colburn's face registered shock and disbelief. Tears streamed down, but they were not tears of remorse. They were the stunned disbelief of a man who had never imagined facing consequences so severe. The man who once wielded power with impunity now faced the full force of justice. As the courtroom emptied, Camille stood to deliver her final words. Approaching the bench, she spoke clearly and resolutely. "Deputy Colburn never asked who I was, because he thought he already knew. And that is the real danger of unchecked power. It stops asking questions. It assumes dominance, not accountability." Her voice carried beyond the walls, a reminder that justice is not granted by authority alone, but earned through courage and truth. Outside, the crowd gathered in hushed anticipation, journalists capturing every moment. Camille's story became a beacon for many, a proof that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, standing firm can break the silence and demand change. The courthouse that had once seemed like a fortress of fear began to breathe again. A community found hope, and with that hope, the promise of a future where justice is more than a word, where is a reality. Months had passed since the seismic courtroom battle that changed Brookage forever. The courthouse halls, once heavy with silence and fear, now buzzed with a cautious but unmistakable energy. Change was in the air, palpable shift in the way justice was being imagined and practiced. And at the heart of that change stood Camille Joyner, not as a victim of violence or a lone crusader, but as a visionary architect of reform. The grand lobby of the courthouse, bathed in soft morning light, was filled with state officials, press, and community leaders gathered for a historic announcement. Flags fluttered quietly in the background, and camera crews jockeyed for position to capture the moment live. At the center of it all, Camille stood poised and composed, wearing a tailored navy blazer that matched the gravitas of the occasion. Stepping up to the podium, Camille's voice rang out clear and resolute. Today marks more than a response to injustice. It marks a commitment to rewriting the rules that have long shielded misconduct and silenced those who dared to speak out. Her words carried the weight of her journey, from the moment she walked into the courthouse alone, clutching that mechanical manila folder, to the months of relentless investigation that followed. She unveiled what would come to be known as the Joyner Doctrine, a comprehensive reform package designed to dismantle systemic abuses embedded within courthouse security operations. The doctrine laid out clear mandates: mandatory annual racial bias audits performed by independent bodies, ensuring that every courthouse would be held accountable beyond internal politics and favoritism. Independent ethics reviews would scrutinize conduct and discipline, replacing the culture of secrecy and cover-ups. Perhaps most groundbreaking were the transparency measures. No longer would interactions between security officers and the public be shrouded in mystery. Mandated camera zones would be installed in all public areas, capturing every encounter to safeguard citizens' rights and create a clear record of events. Monthly public reports detailing complaints, investigations, and disciplinary actions would be published online, offering a new level of scrutiny and public oversight unheard of in many judicial systems. Camille's closing words were a powerful call to action. "Justice must first be just," she declared, her gaze sweeping across the audience. This doctrine is not simply about preventing another Camille Joyner from being assaulted and silenced. It is about creating a system where no one can hide behind a badge to violate the rights of those they are sworn to protect. As the room erupted in applause, the ceremony culminated with the unveiling of a plaque near the courthouse entry. Etched in bronze, the words "Justice must first be just" gleam under the overhead lights, a solemn promise and a public declaration that the old ways were no longer acceptable. The impact of the Joyner Doctrine quickly radiated far beyond the borders of Brokage. News outlets from state capitals to national platforms picked up the story, framing it as a turning point in the ongoing battle for judicial accountability and police reform. Camille Joyner found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, but embraced with the clarity of purpose that had carried her through the darkest moment. Invitations poured in, from legislative hearings to reform panels, from university symposiums to civil rights conventions. Camille became a sought-after voice, not merely for her role in the Brokage case, but for her insightful vision on how justice systems nationwide could confront and uproot systemic racism and abuse of power. State leaders reached out to her office, eager to understand the mechanics of the reforms, the lessons learned, and the practical steps necessary to implement similar changes in their own jurisdictions. Camille's team worked tirelessly to draft toolkits, guidelines, and training programs to share with other courthouse systems struggling with their own histories of misconduct. Despite the national attention, Camille remained deeply connected to her roots in Brooklyn. Community leaders invited her regularly to town hall meetings, where she stood not as a distant official, but as a familiar face, someone who had lived through the trauma and emerged determined to rebuild trust and safety. One chilly evening, during a packed community gathering, Camille entered the room. The hum of conversations fell to a hush as residents rose to their feet, applauding her entrance. She smiled warmly, but kept her focus sharp, knowing the journey ahead was long and arduous. She spoke candidly about the challenges they still faced: entrenched skepticism, the slow grind of bureaucratic change, and the personal toll reform efforts exacted on those brave enough to lead them. But she also spoke of hope, of resilience, and of the power that communities held when they refused to settle for anything less than justice. After her speech, a young law student stepped forward, her voice filled with awe and curiosity. "Ms. Joyner, how did you find the strength to remain calm through everything? The assault, the court battles, the backlash?" Camille took a moment, her eyes reflecting the weight of memory and resolve. "It wasn't about me," she said softly. "It was about the voices silenced before me, the silence I refused to let win. I knew if I gave up their stories would remain buried, and the system would never change." Her words resonated deeply. The crowd erupted in applause once more, not just for Camille, but for the movement she embodied. It was clear that the doctrine wasn't just a set of policies. It was a symbol of a new way forward, a collective refusal to accept injustice cloaked in tradition and power. In the months that followed, the plaque at the courthouse became more than a symbol. It became a pilgrimage site for advocates, students, and ordinary citizens inspired by the story of Camille Joyner and Brookage's transformation. Visitors often paused before it, reading the words, "Justice must first be just," aloud, carrying them like a mantra for change. Camille's office received letters and calls from around the country, some from survivors seeking guidance, others from officials eager to share their own reform efforts. Each message reinforced the growing sense that the fight for justice was no longer isolated, but a wave sweeping across communities hungry for accountability. In quiet moments, Camille reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The folder she once carried, the symbol of her mission, had long since been archived, but its spirit lived on in every policy changed, every testimony heard, every silence broken. At a community event celebrating the first anniversary of the reforms, Camille stood before a room filled with neighbors, activists, and young people ready to carry the torch forward. A local pastor, Pastor Harris, introduced her as a trailblazer who reminded them all that courage was contagious. During the Q&A, the young law student who had asked Camille about her strength returned with a follow-up question. What advice would you give to those facing injustice now? To those who might feel powerless? Camille smiled, the room leaning in to hear her answer. Remember this, justice is not a gift given. It is a right earned through persistence, through courage, and through refusing to let silence be the loudest voice in the room. When the system stops asking questions because it thinks it already knows, that's when true danger begins. Stand firm, speak truth, and never forget that change starts with one voice willing to be heard. As applause filled the hall once more, Camille knew that while her chapter in Brookage's story was drawing to a close, the legacy of the Joyner Doctrine and the movement it inspired would live on, carried forward by every person who chose to step forward rather than step back. The dawn broke slowly over the courthouse steps, pale sunlight casting long shadows across the worn stone. A quiet calm settled over the building, a calm that seemed both fragile and profound, as if the very air held its breath. The courthouse, a sentinel of history and justice, had seen countless faces come and go, each carrying their own burdens and hopes. But today, the story of change. A young black girl approached the steps. She moved with a measured pace, her eyes scanning the towering pillars and tall windows, as if searching for something just beyond reach. The gray hoodie she wore was pulled low over her head, shielding her from the cool morning air, and perhaps the weight of unseen gazes. Her hands clutched a slightly worn folder, edges frayed, corners softened by time and use. Inside that folder lay not just papers, but a symbol of courage and a hope for justice. Her sneakers made soft thuds against the stone steps, a rhythm of quiet determination. This was no ordinary walk. It was a pilgrimage, a passage into a place where silence had been broken and where truth had begun to shine. The girl's shoulders were straight, her posture unyielding despite the heavy burden she carried. At the courthouse entrance, the familiar figures of authority, guards and clerks, stood watchful. But today their eyes softened. The lobby clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, noticed the girl immediately. The atmosphere was different now. A subtle warmth replaced the cold indifference that once permeated this space. The clerk's welcoming gaze was met with a small nod of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement between two women who understood the weight of history. And near the entrance, a deputy on duty, usually stern and distant, gave the girl a respectful nod, a silent gesture of recognition that spoke volumes. The girl returned it with the faintest smile. The days when suspicion and dismissal ruled here were slowly fading. Justice, once confined by walls and whispers, was stepping into the light. As the girl crossed the threshold into the courthouse lobby, the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The lobby, once sterile and forbidding, seemed transformed, more a place of possibility than punishment. She moved forward, her footsteps steady, and approached the clerk's desk, where the folder she carried would begin a new chapter in this long fight. In a quiet, dimly lit office overlooking the courthouse, Camille Joyner sat in contemplative silence. The glow from a large monitor illuminated her face as she watched the live feed of the young girl walking through the lobby. Every deliberate step, every hesitant glance, was a testament to how far the journey had come and how far it still must go. The original manila folder, the one that had sparked a firestorm of truth and justice, lay open on Camille's desk. Its yellowed edges and faded print were a sharp contrast to the digital world of the screen, a physical link to the struggles endured and battles won. The folder represented every hidden story uncovered, every voice raised against the silence, every injustice refused. Camille's eyes traced the movement of the girl on the screen as she reached the clerk. The clerk leaned forward, her hands steady and welcoming, and accepted the folder with care. It was a simple gesture, but it held immense meaning, a silent promise that the truth contained within would be received and honored, not dismissed or ignored. Watching this scene unfold, Camille allowed herself a rare moment of pride. The courthouse, once a place of cold repression, was becoming a space of healing and accountability. The girl, unknown to most, was carrying the torch forward, stepping into the legacy that Camille and so many others had fought to build. Her mind drifted back to the countless nights of struggle, the threats, the court battles, long waits for justice to catch up with courage. All those moments converged in this one, a young girl delivering truth in a place that had once tried to silence it. The folder closed softly as Camille set it down, her fingers lingering on its surface. The fight was far from over, but this simple act, a folder exchanged, a story shared, was a door opening wider than ever before. The young girl turned away from the clerk's desk, clutching her now empty hands with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The folder she had carried, laden with stories, truth, and hard-earned justice, was safely in the hands of those who would honor it. Her footsteps retraced the path she had taken moments before, but the world around her felt changed. The courthouse no longer held the same cold, unyielding weight it once did. Now it seemed alive with possibility, a beacon in the heart of a community hungry for fairness and transparency. Inside the courthouse, Camille Joyner rose from her chair, her gaze lingering on the screen where the girl's figure faded into the distance. The glow from the monitor bathed her face in soft light, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't just a moment of victory. It was a testament to years of perseverance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to be silent. Camille's fingers brushed against the edge of the manila folder resting on her desk. Its surface was worn, the corners dog-eared from years of being handled carefully, almost reverently. That folder had been the catalyst for a reckoning, a symbol of every silenced voice brought into the light. Now it had been digitized and made accessible to all who sought truth. It was no longer a guarded secret. It was a public record, a permanent monument to justice demanded and delivered. She closed the folder slowly, savoring the weight of the moment. It was a quiet act, but one filled with deep meaning. This small piece of paper carried the names, faces, and stories of those who had been ignored for far too long. It was a reminder that justice is not a destination but a continuous journey, one that requires vigilance, courage, and relentless commitment. Camille stood and walked to the window, looking out over the courthouse steps, bathed in morning sunlight. The streets beyond were coming alive, people bustling to work, children laughing on their way to school, life unfolding with the steady rhythm of a new day. But Camille knew that beneath the surface, something profound had shifted. The courthouse was no longer a place where power hid behind silence and intimidation. It had become a place where accountability could not be denied, where voices once suppressed were now heard loud and clear. Her mind drifted to the countless nights spent poring over documents, the endless phone calls, the meetings held in hushed rooms where every word mattered. The threats, the doubt, the fatigue, they all seemed distant now, overshadowed by this moment of quiet triumph. But Camille also knew this was just the beginning. Justice was not a prize to be won and forgotten, it was a responsibility to be carried forward by those willing to fight when others faltered. The young girl who had walked these steps carried that responsibility now. She was part of a legacy, a movement that spanned generations, bound together by the unyielding belief that silence its complicity, and that truth must always be. Camille turned away from the window and walked through the bright hallway, each step echoing softly against the polished floor. She passed offices and meeting rooms where new plans would be made, policies rewritten, and futures shaped. The courthouse had transformed, not just in structure, but in spirit. As she approached the exit, Camille paused. The sun was higher now, casting long, golden beams that filtered through the glass doors. Outside, the city breathed with renewed hope. She stepped forward and crossed the threshold, leaving behind the walls that had witnessed so much pain and so much change. The final frame held on the manila folder once more, now a digitized record, floating in the digital ether. Accessible, transparent, undeniable. It was a symbol not just of Camille's fight or the young girl's courage, but of a community that refused to accept injustice as the norm. Justice, Camille knew, wasn't something you inherited or received passively. It was something you demanded, nurtured, and protected. It was the light that shines brightest when people dare to step forward, to speak out, and to open doors that had long been locked. The screen faded slowly to black, leaving behind a sense of quiet resolve and the promise of a new dawn, a dawn where the last door had been opened, and no one would ever be turned away again,